Hi, I'm so happy to be here and to do this with you, Shankar. So, first question, science and medicine are supposed to be in the business of innovation. Anyone in these fields will tell you there are many obstacles that hinder innovation, a lack of capital, regulatory red tape, internal politics. Now, with your work, you explore how the things that happen outside of our awareness influence us every day. So, in that vein, what are some of the unforeseen obstacles that get in the way of discovery?
Well, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here this morning, Sarah. Thank you for doing this, and thank you to the Jewish Healthcare Foundation for inviting me. So delighted to be part of Liftoff this year. I want to step back for a second to your question, Sarah, and just look at the big picture for just a moment. There's an old saying in science, which is science progresses funeral by funeral. And it's a disturbing but funny idea that in many ways, the insights that we often generate in the world of science often takes years and sometimes decades before they actually reach, the general population. So someone discovers something and it takes a long time before it actually reaches people. And so one of the big obstacles we actually have when it comes to innovation is not just the technology and not just the scientific breakthroughs, but all the psychology that goes into how something goes from an innovation or an invention to actually being of tangible use in the real world. The story that I like to go back to, it's an old story. Many people in the audience might be familiar with it. It's the story of the physician Ignaz Semmelweis. I don't know if you're familiar with the story, Sarah, but he was a physician who arrived at a maternity hospital in Vienna in the 19th century. And he had a scientific bent besides being a doctor. And the maternity hospital had two different wings. It had a wing that was supervised by doctors who in the 19th century were all men, and had a wing of the hospital that was supervised by midwives who were all women. And Semmelweis, having a scientific bent, analyzed what was happening in the different wings of the hospital, the one supervised by doctors and the one supervised by midwives. And he found that women in the wing supervised by doctors were dying at a significantly higher rate than women in the wing supervised by midwives. And no one knew why this was happening. It was inexplicable because the doctors often came from aristocratic families in Vienna. They were among the most educated, the most well-known people. And so no one quite knew what was happening, but patients knew that these were the outcomes because some of them would actually beg the hospital to be transferred to the wing of the hospital where they could be supervised by midwives rather than doctors. So Semmelweis came up with a number of different hypotheses about what could happen. Some of the hypotheses were really crazy. He thought that, as people died in the hospital, a priest would ring a bell as he walked through the hospital, and they thought that maybe the ringing of the bell was causing other patients to fall sick. They didn't really have a very good understanding of the germ theory of disease. Eventually, what happened is one of the physicians on the men's side of the hospital delivered a baby, had delivered a woman's child, and then shortly thereafter came down with symptoms that seemed to resemble the patient who had just died. People call this childbed fever in the 19th century. And so Semmelweis started to hypothesize, was there a connection between what killed the patient and what killed the doctor? And he looked back and had seen what the doctor had done leading up to treating the patient. He realized that the doctor had just conducted an autopsy, because at this time, the doctors would often play the role of pathologists. They would conduct autopsies and then they would deliver a baby. And Semmelweis hypothesized that maybe there was something while conducting the autopsy that got transferred to the patient and then eventually got transferred to the doctor. And this came up with sort of basically the model of the germ theory of disease. And his solution was to have doctors in the medical wing of the hospital wash their hands really thoroughly before they actually delivered babies. And so they used a chlorine disinfectant, which is one of the strongest disinfectants that they had. And lo and behold, within a matter of weeks, the data came back that the death rate on the doctor side of the hospital was the same as the death rate on the midwife side of the hospital. Now, this simple scientific intervention, very dramatic and powerful result. You don't usually see these kinds of results in science where you have very clear categorical information, very clear endpoints, fewer people dying. You would think that everyone would embrace Semmelweis and say, fantastic, we've discovered a new way to actually keep people healthy. But that's not what happened, because when Semmelweis came forward with his theory, the doctor said, are you accusing us of being dirty? We come from the most aristocratic families in Vienna. Are you accusing us of being carriers of disease? That's ridiculous. And Semmelweis, unbelievably, was actually kicked out of the hospital. He was actually removed from the hospital because of all of the the antagonism that he had provoked. And he eventually ended his life at a mental asylum where he was, I'm not making this up, he was literally beaten to death. That's how Ignaz Semmelweis ended his life. And so when you ask, why is it that innovations do not spread in science? Why is it that someone comes up with a discovery and people don't jump up and take it? Think back to the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, because in many ways it carries the psychological seeds of why many innovations actually don't become successful. I think many of us are also fall prey to the illusion that all you need for an innovation is to come up with the idea or to come up with the technology. We fail to see how so many aspects of human behavior are often integral in getting an idea out to the world.
Well, now that you tell me the story, I think you probably covered it on your podcast because I know this story well. And I recall this man lacking soft skills. I recall him writing really caustic letters and saying, "You are killing women and you need to wash your hands, and that makes you a murderer." And so when I think about this story, everything you say is true, but also this is a story of someone who lacks soft skills, who lacks the ability to walk into a room and influence people. And so I think that in innovation, obviously science is important. If we don't have good science, like what's the point of anything? But to me, this story is also the importance of skills that maybe we value less, but are just as important.
I could not agree with you more, Sarah. In fact, I think there's robust evidence from multiple avenues in the social sciences that talk about the value of soft skills. Even when kids go through educational settings, it appears that much of the value of a good education is not in teaching kids, how to solve calculus problems or, how to understand sort of geography, but in learning soft skills and learning how to work with one another, learning how to communicate with one another, learning how to be good listeners, learning how to be good members of a team. Much of the value of education, in fact, appears to be sort of the ability to build these bonds. But I think we so often forget this because, of course, when you're awarded a degree, when you graduate from college, the degree says degree in pharmacology, or it says you've gotten a PhD in botany. It doesn't say you've gotten a PhD in soft skills, but I think the point that you're making is so on point, which is that in order to get an idea out to the world, you have to be working with other human beings. And those other human beings have egos, they have vanities, they have limitations, they have frailties. And if you don't know how to work with them, if you can't communicate with them, if you can't get along, in many ways, the best ideas are actually going to go nowhere. I actually have a new book coming out in a few months called Useful Delusions. And one of the ideas of useful delusions is exactly what you just talked about, which is we often make the mistake of assuming that a good idea communicated bluntly, honestly, and truthfully is all that it takes to communicate and to persuade and to basically get an idea out into the world. And in fact, that's not the case. We know that you need all of these soft skills in order to be able to, in some ways, bring people along with you as you're pursuing your idea.
Going off the fact that your new book is coming out, Useful Delusion, a frequent theme that pops up on Hidden Brain is the importance of stories that we tell ourselves. Stories give meaning to chaos. The narrative we form allows us to make sense of the world around us, informs our values and our outlook. So when it comes to Pittsburgh, how does the story or maybe stories that we tell about our community shape our collective ability to find goals and identify a common purpose?
Right. So when you think about the brain does many wonderful things, but at its heart, I've come to think of the brain as being a story generation machine, because that's what the brain does. It basically tells you a story when you wake up in the morning that basically orients you to what your day is. You're not just taking in the world as it comes in, you have mental models about what the world is. And these mental models inform everything you do from the second you wake up in the morning and you get up to brush your teeth. They inform how you think about the world. They shape what you see. They shape what you don't see. And at the level of innovation, the level of a city, these stories have very powerful, this is true not just at the level of individuals, it's also true at the level of a collective. If you think about, for example, set aside science and technology, look at the world of sports, for example. The story of sports teams is a story, right? I mean, it's absurd that people have the affection and the adulation that they have for sports fans, sports teams, because these are just a group of people, as Jerry Seinfeld once famously said, the same players who are playing for one team one day are playing for the next team the next day. What you're rooting for is you're rooting for laundry, because all you're doing is wearing different jerseys. But yet the story of sports teams is very illustrative because it shows how deeply people can be connected to something that is fundamentally, just it's made up by human beings. Again, I think to go back to what you said a second ago, Sarah, we sometimes underestimate the power of these things that feel like they're soft, because a story feels like it's a soft thing. But when you think about it, what is a country? A country is really nothing but a set of stories. It's an arbitrary set of lines drawn by human beings, and it's brought together by a shared narrative of who we are, what we mean. And that's why when you have, a tornado in Kansas, somebody who lives in California who has no connection to the person in Kansas says, this is my problem. I feel connected because we're all Americans. We're all in this together. Exactly the same thing at the level of a city. When you think about what you need to do to move an organization forward, to move a city forward, you need a shared story in order to bring people together, because human beings have this tremendous capacity to be moved and motivated by stories, to sort of see themselves as being part of a larger model. And telling those stories is vitally important. Coming up with those stories is vitally important. And then finding exemplars who basically exemplify the best elements of that story to say, here's the story we have, and look at this character that we have who exemplifies the story, allows us to move the story forward from generation to generation.
And I totally agree with everything you said, but sometimes stories can also harm. Sometimes stories erase pain or crime or the sins of the past. For example, we deify George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as moral and smart and brave, but we erase the fact that they owned slaves.
Yeah.
So how can we, and I agree that stories are important for uniting a people and getting everyone to focus on a common goal, but how can we tell stories that acknowledge, that are more honest, that acknowledge our shortcomings as a city, as a society, but still captures the power that they hold?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, which is that stories are powerful. And some of the stories, regardless of whether they're being used for good or bad, stories can be very powerful. Let me step aside a little bit from the example you gave and actually tell another story, which might get in the way of the story that Pittsburgh is trying to tell today. So when you think about Pittsburgh, when people outside of Pittsburgh think of Pittsburgh, what do they think about? What is the story that pops to mind when you think about Pittsburgh, right? So for a long time, Pittsburgh was associated with the steel industry. It was associated with being blue collar. It's associated with manufacturing. Now, that's not the story necessarily of Pittsburgh today. There is some of that in Pittsburgh today, but that's not the story of Pittsburgh today. But it shows how powerfully our stories shape what we think about a region. When you think about Silicon Valley, what is the story that you hear about Silicon Valley? Just look at the name. The name is Silicon Valley, right? The story of Silicon Valley is contained in its name. The story of the Steel City is contained in its name. And so stories are incredibly powerful, partly because they have this inertia, because once set in motion, they basically have this ability to carry on and carry on and carry on. Now, the point that you're raising is a vitally important point. When you think about the story of a country like the United States, it's absolutely the case that the positive stories we tell about what it means to be American are part of what bring us together. Now, does that mean that sometimes you're suppressing other kinds of stories that might be more honest in terms of what our history might be? And the answer might be sometimes the answer is yes. And so I think there is a tension and a dilemma here, because I think the same things that bring a country together, looked at very honestly and in a very clear-eyed fashion, might not bring people together. So part of the illusion of stories is that there actually is a story, that there actually is a model. The world, in fact, is chaotic and it's disruptive, and it has all these different things coming on. Models give us coherence of the world. It gives us a sense of synthesis that allows us to move forward. The story of a city, for example, like Pittsburgh, the challenge that you have is not just in coming up with a story. The challenge is, how do you set that old story to rest? Or how do you find a way to transition that old story into a new story? How do you take that story and make a twist? When you look at our greatest, if you look at the great epics that have been written down history, these have often been written over dozens or hundreds of years sometimes, and they often involve taking an existing story and morphing it into a new story, because you realize that you can't actually completely eliminate the old story because it's so powerful, it has such longevity. You have to actually take it and steer it in a new direction. And I think the question then to ask is, from the point of view of the city, how do you take that story of Pittsburgh, the old story of Pittsburgh, the powerful story of Pittsburgh, and mold it into something new? Not just say, I can discard that old story altogether, but I'm turning it by 20 degrees at a time into something that is actually new.
Right, and not to belabor the point, but what concerns me about stories in history, and history is a collection of stories, is that
Yes.
history is written by the people in power. And something that I focus on a lot in my work as a healthcare reporter, I cover a lot of disparity in our healthcare system. And so when I think about the stories that we talk about in medicine in Pittsburgh as this incredible center of innovation, it's also a place of profound, profound unequal access to healthcare. For example, we have one of the highest Black maternal mortality rates in the country, and to me,
Yeah.
it's very upsetting that we have these amazing centers of innovation and that women are dying from very preventable things. And so to me, like when I think about stories, I'm like, how can we tell a story that is honest about where we've come, but where we want to go?
Yeah, so I think your role as a journalist is very much to tell all those different stories. Your role as a journalist is to surface the disparities that we see. So the infant mortality rate, for example, is a very good predictor of where communities are around the world. If you want a one-stop shop to see how a community is doing, just ask what's the infant mortality rate in that community. For many years now, the Black infant mortality rate in the United States has been significantly higher than the white infant mortality rate in the country. And that's just one example of numerous examples that show the disparities that we have in the country. And the job of good reporters and good journalists is to surface those disparities, bring them to the light, bring them to the light of day, to have transparency about it. The stories that I think we're talking about are somewhat slightly different. And they're different in this manner, which is you're asking yourself, how do I move a city forward? How do I get people to want to move forward, to basically say, this is a common wish that are built around this common purpose. So a sports team is built around a common purpose. You want to win the Super Bowl. There's a shared sense of purpose. How do you bring people in a city around the shared purpose of wanting to reduce disparities in a community? That's where I think stories come in, not just the stories that elevate the problem, that basically say, here's the problem, but a story that says, here's why you are a part of the solution. Let me give you the simplest of examples. If you think back to the civil rights movement and the great accomplishments of the civil rights movement, one of the great accomplishments that the civil rights movement did was it made people who were not African Americans, not living in the Jim Crow South, feel like the civil rights movement was their struggle. It was their struggle as well, that you could be a 9-year-old white girl who was living in Wisconsin, and the civil rights struggle was your struggle as well, right? So in other words, it tapped into things that were universal. And one of the genius of Martin Luther King Jr. was that he wrapped himself in the American flag, even as he was making a critique of America, right? So the I Have a Dream speech, for example, is written in the shadow of the Lincoln Monument. You know, Lincoln had many things about his history that were not sort of the great emancipator story that we tell nowadays about Lincoln, but using the metaphors of Lincoln helped Martin Luther King Jr. tell the story about how a shared vision about America as a land of equality, as a land of opportunity, as a land of fairness meant that we also have to think about the unfairness that was happening in America today. So I don't mean, so there are two different kinds of stories, I think, and we're using the words perhaps slightly differently. The way that journalists think of stories, I think, is right, which is you should be elevating stories that are in the shadows and bringing them to the light of day. But the story that leadership has to practice, the practice of leadership often involves telling a story that involves shared purpose, that involves collective purpose. And some of that might involve a story that is not entirely accurate to the facts, right? So I think going back to the Semmelweis example we talked about, you could ask, why is it important to get along nicely with others? Why is it important to speak politely with others? Why can't I just simply say, I have discovered something and the rest of you are idiots for not seeing what I see, and you should just follow what I'm saying. Now, at one level, that's being completely truthful, and we all know that isn't going to work. And so part of the dilemma, I think, of the story of stories is that the stories we tell are like the sugar, the sugar syrup that allow the medicine to go down, right? And so the stories are vitally important in creating a package that allows useful and powerful ideas to actually do good in the world.
I mean, that sounds like propaganda, but not necessarily bad propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing is when you think about the story of the United States as being a land of opportunity, as a land of equality, as a land of fairness, as a beacon of freedom around the world, is that propaganda? Now, you can look at American history and you can say this is a country that had slavery for a far longer period than it's had an emancipation of the slaves. You can say this is a country where Native American populations were treated extraordinarily poorly. How did this country become a beacon of freedom? Is that propaganda? And at one level, you can say, yes, it is propaganda because it is not an accurate statement of everything that happens. But I think what I'm trying to say, the point that I'm trying to make is that every great movement, every great nation is brought together by a set of myths, by a set of stories. And some of those things are actually myths, are actually outright falsehoods, but that's what brings people together as a group, as a community. You can think of any of the groups that you belong to. Think about the ethnic groups you belong to, the gender groups you belong to, the age groups you belong to. They're often brought together by shared stories, some of which involve fictions about themselves and fictions about other people. Now, you can say from a purely truth-telling perspective, all we should care about is the truth. But go back to the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. The truth alone is not sufficient to actually get to where we want to go. When you want to bring human beings together, you actually have to bring them together under the shared rubric of a story, a shared vision of what it means to be Americans. And the genius, again, about the civil rights movement is by enlisting those stories about what it meant to be Americans, the civil rights movement accomplished a great deal that would have been impossible to do otherwise. It actually put equal rights on the table in a way that had not been put on the table before. It made the defense of civil rights something that people who are not African American felt like they could care about. Another very good example of this is to think about the success of the gay rights movement over the last 25 years. I mean, the accomplishments of the gay rights movement are astonishing when you think about where the country was 25 years ago and where it is today. But part of the success of the gay rights movement was to be able to tell a very successful story about what it meant to be gay. And the story of gay marriage is central. The equality of marriage, the movement to have equal opportunity for marriage was central. There were many scholars who basically said, marriage is not the thing that we should be arguing about. Marriage, in fact, has numerous problems. It has numerous inequalities, and it is some part of the patriarchy. It is built on many injustices and problems. And the genius of the gay rights movement was the story of marriage is a very powerful story. It's embedded deeply in our psyche. And if we can take that powerful story and enlist it in the service of tolerance, in the service of fairness, in the service of equality, it can accomplish remarkable things. And so, yes, if human beings were wiser and braver creatures, we could just tell people the truth and the truth would succeed. But human beings being what they are, the stories we tell about regions, the stories we tell about groups are vitally important if you want to bring people together. And this is part of the practice of leadership.
So going off that, when I think about the story of Pittsburgh, the story that I see civic leaders and business leaders proud to tell is that we were a steel city, and then steel that no longer was lucrative, and we went through a very hard economic period, and then we reinvented ourselves as ed, smets, and tech. How can we, I guess, build on that story, that narrative to take us, further and accomplish the things we need to do and raise everybody up in the city?
Yeah, so I think the challenge is to ask yourself, what are the subtexts in different stories that speak to what it is that you want to do in the future? So part of the story of being the steel city, or being the industrial heartland, is a story of resilience, is a story of blue collar work, is a story of, so for example, to speak about the questions of disparities, the idea of blue collar work and the idea of caring for people who are at different ends of the spectrum, that there's a dignity to the work that people do regardless of where they come, is a very important value that comes from the idea of blue collar work, right? That the work that you do with your hands is incredibly important to getting people together, this is how you actually bring a team together. So it's not surprising to me that the idea of teamwork, for example, is built into the idea, could be built into the idea of manufacturing, could be built into the idea of the steel city. So when you're thinking about how do you take a story and you turn it, ask yourself, what are the elements of that story that are the elements that we want to continue in the future? So when you think about Silicon Valley today, what are the metaphors that spring to mind when you think about Silicon Valley? The metaphors that spring to mind are the metaphors of innovation, of disruption, of inventiveness. Right. So what are the metaphors that come to mind in a city? And this is not, I think, someone coming up with one idea and basically saying, here's how you take the story and actually morph it into something new. Part of how you move a region forward or a city forward is to bring different stakeholders together, to bring different institutions together and ask, what is it that brings us together, not just what allows us to compete with one another? There's I don't know if the story is apocryphal, but when the United States and the Soviet Union were planning their initial space missions together, the Apollo-Soyuz missions many years ago. The rule that the American astronauts were asked to do is they were asked to learn Russian and speak to the Russian cosmonauts in Russian. And the Russian cosmonauts were asked to learn English and speak to the American astronauts in English. And you could say at one level, this is absurd. Why are you asking Americans to speak in Russian when it's their second language and asking Russians to speak in English when it's their second language? But the great psychological insight here is that we are going to be better understood, not when we speak our language, but when we speak someone else's language. Even when we speak that second language poorly, we will be better understood if we can speak that other person's language. So when we bring together people in a community, and this is partly, I think, what Liftoff is trying to do, you're asking people to come together, not just to say, here's what I believe, here's what I want, here's my story, but you're also asking people, how do I speak in someone else's language? How do I see what is important to them? This question that you're raising, Sarah, questions of disparity, these are part of the conversation that we need to have, which is how do you sit, if you're not somebody who is at the receiving end of the table, if you're somebody in positions of power, if you're in positions of prestige and authority, how do you get this person to see the stories of people who are at the short end of the stick? And so partly the question of storytelling involves this ability to come together and craft a narrative together, right? So you have someone from two sides of Pittsburgh. They might not talk to one another if they meet at a conference, but take the same two people and have them bump into each other at a museum in France, and suddenly they'll be bonded together. They'll feel like they're part of the same group. So why is that? Depending on the context, our sense of who we're part of a group with changes, right? So the days after 9/11, people would say there are no Republicans and there are no Democrats in the United States. We're all Americans because you're united together under the threat of a common enemy. And this is actually one of the powerful motivators to bring people together. When you think about what brings teams together, one of the stories that brings people together is a story of shared purpose that's often in conjunction with how the city or the group or the team sees itself relative to other people. Mm-hmm. So I think part of how you bring people together as a group is to ask yourself, what are the shared opportunities and the shared threats that you face together? Because it's often in the face of shared threats that people realize the connections they have with one another. They realize how important it is to actually work together.
And something I wanted to ask you is, what does psychology tell us about how we can get people to work together? Is it as simple as finding a shared threat, a shared enemy, or is there more to it than that?
So human beings have a remarkable capacity to form groups. I mean, when you think about it, we form groups in all kinds of different things. And psychological experiments have shown you don't need very much to get people to form a group. You can give 50 people in a room red t-shirts and 50 people in a room blue t-shirts. And after half an hour, the red t-shirt people will think they're part of one group and the blue t-shirt people will think they're part of another group. And this is not surprising because, again, when you think about the brain and think about the mind, part of what we are designed to do is to work together in groups, right? When you think about human beings as a species, we don't have sharp claws, we don't have big teeth, we're not the strongest creatures on the planet. So how is it that we've actually come to dominate the planet the way we have? And the answer is quite simple. We've actually figured out ways to work cooperatively with one another, right? We're able to work together in large coalitions. And there are elements of our minds that in some ways are designed to be harnessed into these large coalitions. And so I think in many ways we're working with fertile territory here because in many ways we are able to be bonded together in groups. And so the challenge I think for leadership is not how do we morph the brain to change the brain to be willing to work together in groups. Human beings are indiscriminately willing to be part of groups and teams and large movements. The question is, how do you give them common purpose? How do you give them sacred causes that bring people together? When you think about a sports team, it's absurd that people in different parts of Pittsburgh see themselves bonded together by the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Half the people playing for the Pittsburgh Steelers have nothing to do with Pittsburgh. They're not connected to the city at all. And yet people feel a shared sense of common purpose, a shared sense of pride when the team does well. They feel a sense of loss when the team does poorly. Think about what that could mean at the level of innovation, at the level of scientific innovation. How can you build together a team that says, here's a shared challenge, here's a common purpose? How do you tell that story that says, we're in this together, perhaps we're in this together against a common opponent?
You did a show earlier this year about how diversity ignites creativity. And I guess my question is, how do you bring together, is it just through the power of storytelling that you bring together people from different backgrounds, different parts of the world, different education levels? Is it just through storytelling that you can get people to share their backgrounds and, ignite creativity, which is really potent? Or is there something more to it than that?
So I think there are lots of different ways to do it. And maybe it makes sense to actually start with the practical and the pragmatic. There's been a lot of research that shows that diverse teams are often able to see things that non-diverse teams are not able to see. And you can see this in psychological experiments and different kinds of psychological experiments. If you bring jurors together in a criminal justice trial, and the jurors come from different backgrounds, they not
Mhm.
only come to different conclusions, but they're often able to see things in the evidence that's provided to them that groups from more homogeneous groups are less able to see. Um,
Mhm.
at Harvard University, Richard Freeman once ran this very interesting experiment involving scientific papers. As you know, Sarah, one metric of quality and impact of scientific papers is to see how often they get cited by other researchers. So if you publish a paper and that paper gets cited by a lot of other researchers, the citation index of a paper is one measure of the impact that it's had in the field. And Freeman did a very simple study. He basically just analyzed what is the diversity of the co-authors of different papers, and is there a relationship between the diversity of the authors of the paper and the impact that this paper has as measured by scientific citations. And what Richard Freeman found was that the diversity of the co-authors on papers was a powerful predictor of the impact that a paper would have. And diversity here writ broadly, gender diversity, racial diversity, geographic diversity, people, teams that work in different areas. So at a very pragmatic level, it appears that there are just simply benefits to having different people come together across a table. From a psychological perspective, I think the reason this happens is that we all come to the table with our stories, with our models of how the world works. And those models, as we've just been discussing, are very powerful, but they also have blind spots. All our models, all our stories have blind spots. When you come together with different people around the table, it's not that those blind spots disappear. It's just that my blind spot might not be the same as your blind spot. And what you have around the table is a variety of different kinds of blind spots. And what that allows the group as a whole to see is it allows people to see things around each other's blind spots. It allows people to bring things to the table they might not have brought to the table otherwise. But yes, I think in terms of how you bring diverse teams together, part of it again is to show people that this diverse group is part of a larger group. In other words, our
Mhm.
tendency to form tribes, to stick to our homogeneous group, is a very powerful tendency. Human beings find this all the time. If you go, back in the day before COVID, when we were all working together in offices, if you visited your standard office cafeteria in any given day, you would find people clustering together. You would find people from the same gender clustered together, people from the same age group clustered together, people from the same racial groups clustered together. So human beings have a strong tendency to form together, to form these clusters. And you can't sort of do away with that and say, I wish this tribal tendency in the human mind would disappear. But what you
Mhm.
can do is you can enlist this tribal tendency to say, there is a larger group that you're part of that we want to see your loyalties toward. And there are lots of different ways of doing this. The civil rights movement that we mentioned a little while earlier did this very effectively. It said, instead of seeing this as black versus white, see this in terms of the larger structure of the United States of America. Wrap yourself in the flag and ask yourself, we're all in this together. This is what the gay rights movement did. It basically successfully showed a number of straight people that they were united under a common rubric of what it meant to be
Mhm.
in a deep, abiding, loving relationship with another person. You're enlisting the stories that basically show people the divisions that we have in terms of the groups we have. Yes, those divisions are real, but they're brought together under a larger rubric, a larger framework. And so I think one of the challenges of diversity is you want to bring people from different groups together. When you do that, you run the risk of sometimes producing conflict because people with different groups have different models in their heads and different stories in their heads. And you want to make sure that they are brought together under that structure that says we're part of a larger group. Sports teams do this very effectively, but regions do this very effectively as well. If you think about regions that are associated with certain things, they're often brought together under a shared story that allows people from different groups to come together to say, I might be from Menlo Park, I might be from Palo Alto, I might be from San Francisco, but we're brought together under the rubric of Silicon Valley. We're brought together under this rubric of what it means to be an area or region of innovation. In Pittsburgh, you have to ask yourself the same question. As people come together from these different groups and you want to have different groups together at the table, how can you bring them together under the shared rubric?
So it's not, in addition, it's not enough though to just make sure, and I don't think you're suggesting this, but when hiring, for example, it's not enough to say we're going to hit these benchmarks for women and people of color. Um, you have to make sure that they feel empowered in the organization to show up as their full selves and be able to do their best work and feel comfortable taking chances. And when you are from a marginalized group, that's harder. So, what are some things that organizations and leaders can do? Maybe build guardrails or change behaviors within the organization to cultivate this diversity. And then these people that they're bringing on that maybe are not from the dominant group are empowered to do their best work.
Yeah. So the deep subtext of the question that you're asking, Sarah, is sort of the tension between organizational hierarchy and systems and sort of the importance of innovation and bringing in new voices, right? And in many ways, it's important to recognize that both those things are really vitally important, right? You cannot have institutions function without traditions, without norms, without rules, without saying, this is our history, here's how we came to be who we are, right?
Mhm.
If you think
But
about
sometimes those norms are used as cudgels to keep certain people in line.
absolutely right. Think about the practice of medicine, for example, right? Imagine, for example, that all you did in medicine, you basically said, we're going to blow up the system every day and bring in new ideas every day. Much of the things that you end up in medicine are going to end up being terrible ideas. Part of the reason medicine accomplishes what it accomplishes is because we have decades and decades of history and tradition and practice that basically say, here's how we did it in 1930. We made a small tweak in 1940. Here's what we did in 1950. And the way you do the surgery today is built on this foundation of ideas. So the tradition is actually really important. It's really vital to say this, which is you don't want to throw out all of the traditions. You know, when you think about evolution and nature, most evolution, most natural selection involves small tweaks of existing systems. It's not a good idea if you're trying to create a new species to say, let me throw out the previous 3 billion years of natural selection and evolution, all that knowledge, and start afresh. That's not a good idea. You want to maintain your traditions and structures. The dilemma, as you're pointing out, and as you're noting, is that those same structures and traditions make it really difficult for new ideas to emerge. This is the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. So the Semmelweis story is a story of a new innovation that came into being, but it butted up, it bumped up against the powerful traditions that Vienna Medical Society had, and the power structures in Vienna Medical Society essentially destroyed the new innovation. The balance between these two things is really vital. And it's important to recognize that you actually want a balance. You don't want to be blowing up things every day and basically starting from ground zero every day. You're not going to have good options. But if you're so set in your ways that you cannot see the value of new things, you're never going to change. You're never going to have innovation. This is one of the challenges of leadership. One of the challenges of leadership is, how do you bring in new ideas? How do you let those new ideas infuse what you're doing? How do you let those new ideas change the existing structures and traditions without necessarily blowing up those structures and traditions altogether? Now, I'm not saying there are some structures and traditions that don't need to be blown up altogether. Some of them maybe do. There might be traditions and structures that are so out of place, that are so wrong, that the only thing to do is to blow them up and start from ground zero. But if that's your first instinct for every change that you want to make, you're actually not just going to, it's not just going to be difficult, you're going to be unsuccessful. Because the traditions and structures that keep societies in place are extraordinarily powerful. And one of the things that successful change makers do is they recognize those structures and traditions are powerful, and they ask, how do I work with those existing structures and traditions to bring about the change that we're doing? And we've talked about this in lots of different ways, Sarah. You know, it's not enough just to have an idea and basically say, my idea is the right idea and all of you are idiots. Even if you have the right idea and everyone around the table are idiots, it's not a good idea to say that. You know, how you present the idea, how you get people to work with you, to recognize, for example, if you're suggesting something that involves changes and losses for other people, it's really important to understand what those changes and losses are, to sort of put that squarely on the table to say, if we as a group, as a city, as a region, if we stop doing things this way and did things this way instead, it's going to produce all these great benefits 5 years from now. So why does it not happen? You have all these people who are resistant to change. You have to ask yourself, why is it they are resistant to change? What are the losses they would experience if the change were to happen? It's important in some ways to think about this almost the way you would think about a psychotherapist thinks about, you know, a patient who comes in for help. The psychotherapist might see on day one that the patient has an anger problem, a drinking problem, a money problem, financial problems, domestic issues. The person has all these problems. But if the psychotherapist says, my job is just to tell you on day one, your life would be turned around if you could stop drinking, stop smoking, stop using drugs, stop being angry, be kinder to the people in your life would be much better. That might be true, but it's not going to be effective, right? Because partly what the psychologist, the psychotherapist needs to do is to understand what is keeping this person from accomplishing where they need to go. How do I understand what are the constraints that hold this person behind? This is what great leadership does. It basically asks the question, the difficult question, the opponents whom I'm trying to persuade, the people whom I'm trying to persuade, what is holding them back? Let me look at their constraints with curiosity, not just look at their constraints and sort of say, these are idiots, these are morons, these are stubborn people, but to say, what is keeping them back? What would they lose if this change were to happen? How do I frame this struggle to basically enlist the things that they care about? Because successful movements in the end are not just about great ideas. We've hit this multiple times throughout the last 30, 40 minutes. Successful movements involve groups of people coming together under a shared purpose. That is the role of leadership. The role of leadership is not just to come up with great ideas. The role of leadership is to give people common structures, a common vision, understand the losses that people might have to experience in order to move a society forward. All of us do this as parents. My job as a parent is not just to tell my child, here's the right way to do it, give up your old way of doing it, do it this way. My job as a parent is to understand where my child is, to understand how can I be empathetic to where she is, even as I recognize that she might need to change some important part of where she is. That practice of leadership involves an element of love, but involves an element of tough love as well. It involves an element of saying, I can see the vision, I can see a vision for the future, and I can see how we should try and get there.
Kind of going off that, it made me think about vaccine hesitancy, people who don't believe, it's not that they think vaccines are bad, but they are suspicious of the coronavirus vaccine, maybe because they are from a community that has been historically abused by by medicine. Perhaps they are suspicious of the pharmaceutical industry. There's lots of reasons that people are very suspicious of the COVID vaccine specifically. And and the way that experts talk about addressing these concerns isn't saying, well, you're stupid and you're paranoid and you're like those crazy people on the internet. It's like, hey, I hear you. You have a legitimate concern. Let me address that. To me, that really rings true.
I think you're exactly right, Sarah, because I feel like our standard approach, and this might be sort of informed by sort of our engagements on social media, someone says something, the tendency on social media is for somebody else to come along and say, you're an idiot. And maybe that works fine on Twitter, and maybe it gets you followers on Twitter, but it's not a very effective strategy when it comes to changing other people's behavior. And think about the people in your own life. Think about people who you're sharing your home with right now. How successful would you be if you went to those people and told them, you're really an idiot for believing what you're believing? Even if you're absolutely 100% right, how effective is that going to be? And I think partly this is the challenge of COVID, the challenge of vaccines, really a fundamental, it's not just a technological problem, it's not just a scientific problem, it's not just a medical problem. It is a problem of human nature, it's a problem of human behavior, right? One of the things that's really valuable to do is to think about even the phrases that we use of basically saying this person is a climate change denier, this person is a denialist, this person is a conspiracy theorist. Even when those things are true, is that actually the effective way to change people's minds? Is it actually, when was the last time someone came and told you, your belief in X is a conspiracy theory, stop believing that, and you say, oh, okay, I realized that my belief was a conspiracy theory, I'm going to stop believing X, I'm now going to believe something else. When was the last time that happened to you? When was the last time someone came along and said, you're an idiot, don't believe this, believe that, and you went along with it? In many ways, I think starting the story, starting the engagement with curiosity and compassion is the way that all effective change actually happens. If you think about changes in history, the really sweeping societal changes have always started with empathy, with curiosity, with compassion. They basically say, let me understand where you are. Let me understand what is actually motivating you. If you're worried about vaccines, maybe you're worried about vaccines because in the past, your group has been burned by the medical establishment. Let me understand where that fear is coming from. Let me understand where that distrust is coming from. How can I address that distrust? Because in many ways, the challenge is not a challenge of scientific information. The challenge is, how do you overcome the distrust? Think about what's happening writ large with COVID across the country. The fact that we have these absurd political divisions about whether to wear masks around the country. It's a
Mhm.
very dangerous thing when things that are involving science get politicized to the extent that we think that being a good member of one party involves wearing a mask, or being a good member of another party involves not wearing a mask. It's a very dangerous idea when that happens, because now your public health choices are shaped by your tribal loyalties to different parties. Now, the way to overcome that, again, is not to double down on the partisan divisions and basically say people from the other party are idiots, people on the other party are misled. The place to do this is to say, how can we move the public health conversation outside the political realm altogether? Because there are some things that should not be politicized. Wearing a mask, getting a vaccine, these are not political questions. These are certainly public health questions, they're medical questions, they're conversations that we should be had between patients and doctors. But again, start from a psychological perspective. One of the important things to keep in mind is that human beings are powerfully shaped by the behavior of those around them. So when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, in some ways, we're inadvertently sending the message that there are a lot of people who are hesitant about using vaccines. That might not actually be the most effective way to change people's behavior. On multiple grounds where psychologists have gone in and tried to change people's behavior when it comes to school bullying, for example, it turns out it's far more effective, rather than tell people, don't be part of the group of people who are bullies. It's far more effective to tell people, most people in the school are really against bullying. Most people in this group, most people in the school really are against smoking. Smoking is really something that vast numbers of people in the school believe that is a bad idea. It's important to communicate in some ways where the norm is, rather than focusing on where the aberrations are, because the norms are powerful in shaping our behavior and shaping what we will eventually end up doing. Again, think about this using the psychological lens, not just from the lens of what is right, what do the peer-reviewed empirical studies say, what is the science and the data say. All those things are vitally important. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying those are not important, but to actually have the impact we want to see in the world, this involves engaging very actively with human behavior.
Well, I think we have to leave it there. It has been such a fun pleasure to start my Tuesday morning talking with you. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you so much to the Jewish Healthcare Foundation for asking me to interview. It's been really great.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been fun. It's been a real honor.